So today we're going to be talking about the Texas legislature. Again, as we discussed before, right, when we talk about the legislature, we're talking about the lawmaking body of government, right? Three major bodies of government: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch. The legislative branch is Congress at the national level, Congress at the state level, the city level, that would be city council. The executive is going to be the president, the governor, the mayor at the local level. And the judiciary is obviously going to be the courts. These three branches of government is going to be our focus over the next 3 weeks. But for today, we're going to begin with the legislature. The legislature in Texas is a bicameral legislature. This means it has two chambers. A unicameral legislature would mean just one chamber. Those two chambers are the House and the Senate. This is the same way that's set up federally. We have 181 representatives in the Texas Congress. There are 150 House members and there are 31 senators. These are represented one representative at a time from each district. So there are going to be 150 House districts and 31 Senate districts. You can see in the map here, this is what we have for districts in Texas. Okay. What does the legislature do, right? At their core, right, is they are writing bills that they intend to make into law, right? So creating public policy and having a central hand in creating law. They propose constitutional amendments. They adopt a budget every year. They levy taxes. They redistrict. They redraw those district boundaries from which they are voted from. That happens once every 10 years after a census. It's called redistricting. They also have the power to impeach the executive, the governor, and certain members of the judiciary. Each of these we will cover a little. So before we go into depth about what the legislature does, we'll talk a little bit more about who they are and what their qualifications are. Members of the House have an election every 2 years, and they serve 2-year terms. Members of the Senate have elections every 2 years, but their terms are 4 years. So for every 2 years, we'll be electing half of the Senate members. But once we elect them, they serve for 4 years. Each of those members, the House and senators, can be reelected an unlimited amount of times. The formal qualifications for the Senate: you have to be 26 years old. You have to be a resident of your district for 1 year and a 5-year voter or a 5-year state of Texas resident. For the House, you have to be 21 years old. You have to be a 1-year resident of your district, and you have to be a 2-year resident of the state of Texas. Okay, we're breaking down to roughly 800,000 residents represented per Senate seat and 167,630 citizens per House seat. Right. Our legislature meets in what's called a regular session. This is when they meet to do their business and create bills, budgets, right? 140 days out of every 2 years. Second Tuesday in January of every odd number year, and it lasts for 140 days. This is limited by our Texas Constitution because they wanted to make it difficult for our legislature to get a lot done, right? That certainly is the case today, right? It's very difficult to get much more done in the budget and a few major initiatives or pieces of legislation. The governor does have the power to call a special session. He can call a special session and bring Congress in for 30 days to try and get an additional amount of work done. Their compensation for both the representatives is they make $7,200 a year. They also get $21,000 for that 140-day expenses, for that 140-day session, and that's to pay their expenses. So for their hotel room, food per diem. They also get a fund to cover their travel expenses, their staff, things of that nature, right? But it's not something in which it's a high dollar position. The most powerful position in the Senate, or the upper house, the more powerful house of the Texas legislature, is lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor is popularly voted on by the people of Texas, or popularly elected, and serves as the president of the Senate. This is often considered to be the most powerful elected office in Texas. Lieutenant governor has the ability to appoint committee chairs, to determine which bills go to what committees. He is the tiebreaker vote, right? And he also recognizes speakers on the floor. You can think of him as the president of the Senate. His counterpart in the lower chamber, or his counterpart in the House, is the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House will do the same type of things that the Lieutenant Governor does in the Senate, but for the House. So he will appoint his committee chairs. He will decide what bills go to what committees. He will recognize speakers on the floor. The Speaker of the House rarely needs to vote, right? His party is usually going to win out in a vote if a bill makes it that far. So he rarely is going to need to vote. Those are your two major positions, right? Below them, they use what are called whips to help enforce party discipline and make sure everyone is voting the way that they would like them to, right? But this is much more pronounced at the federal level than the local level. So the two major offices, right, are the Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor. Lieutenant Governor is popularly elected. The Speaker of the House is voted on among the House members each session. Usually that same speaker will remain the same as long as he or she serves in the House. They'll continue to elect he or she as long as the same party is in power. However, right, the speaker technically is elected each session by the representatives themselves. Our legislature is also able to begin the amendment process to the Texas Constitution. In that process, through a 2/3 vote of all members in the House and all members in the Senate, they're able to pass a proposed amendment. That amendment will then be passed on to the voters. The other major duties, and even more so than amendments, right, impeachment, right, or relatively equal to maybe amendments in this state. But another major duty of the legislature, nonetheless, is impeachment. The impeachment process, the House will vote to impeach. This is a majority vote of all those members, right? After that, the Senate hears the evidence against that judge or that executive who's being impeached, and with a 2/3 vote, can vote to dismiss them, right? So we're thinking in the case of Bill Clinton, it works the same in the federal level. You had a majority of House members vote to impeach Clinton, right? But he was not removed from office because you didn't have 2/3 of the senators finding Clinton guilty, right? They also have this job of impeachment. Lastly, right? Lastly, we'll discuss gerrymandering or redistricting. Before we get to that, we'll talk about the enacting of bills or resolutions and the process through which that happens. Next, we're going to discuss the process through which a bill becomes a law. It's important to remember as we discuss this that the House or the Senate can change their procedures on the Senate floor in the middle of a session. So this isn't always going to be the case, right? A bill may become a law in a number of different ways, right? You'll see when you do the hobby reading for next week or the week after, I believe, right, that sometimes it's not always as cut and dry. But it begins, the first step is the introduction of the bill to the House or to the Senate. Usually, when the bill is introduced in one chamber, it's also introduced in the other chamber at the same time. This is called a companion bill and occurs when a similar bill is introduced in both chambers. The passage or the goal of a companion bill is to speed legislation. After that, you have the first reading in the House or the Senate floor, and then it's going to be referred to a committee. There's a number of different subcommittees. You have committees on agriculture, you have committees on education, a number of different committees. They would receive each different bill, and these committees work it over. They have times for hearings, for public hearings. They can redo the bill, they can kill the bill, they can change the bill. From there, once it moves out of that committee, it goes to a calendar committee, at which point it's found when they can vote on it on the floor. They schedule a time during the session that they can vote on it. The next step is a second reading on the floor after it's come out of committee, followed by a debate. Lastly, there's a third reading of the bill after any amendments that have been made or changes to it on the floor. There's a third reading of the bill and a vote. A majority vote of those representatives who are present will pass the bill through the House or through the Senate. This bill has to pass the House and the Senate in order to move on to the governor. If the bill passes the House and a different bill passes the Senate, then another committee, a conference committee, is formed. It is within this committee that changes are made to the bill. Once this is agreed upon and signed off on by Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House, then it goes to the governor. The governor can do three things. The governor can sign the bill, in which it becomes law. The governor can leave the bill unsigned for 10 days, in which it also becomes law. Or the governor can choose to veto the bill, in which case it goes back to the House and Senate. If the bill has been vetoed, you need a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate to override the governor's veto and make it a law. If
There's been a lot of debate at the Capitol on bills relating to voter integrity.
Some lawmakers are pushing for measures such as requiring voters to show a photo ID before being allowed to cast a ballot. Another bill would criminalize anyone who delivers a ballot for someone unable to drive to the polls. Now, with so much emphasis on one vote for one person, you'd think lawmakers would make sure they follow the rules too. In tonight's CBS 42 Investigates, Nancy Wilson found out many don't.
It's a record vote. Clerk, please read the bill.
This is State Representative Debbie Riddle. She authored the bill that would require voters to show a photo ID.
Clerk, bring the bill. It's a record vote.
It's all about integrity.
Record vote.
But the integrity of one person, one vote doesn't apply at the legislature. We found many lawmakers vote more than once. Take a look. Riddle votes, turns around, votes again for State Rep Temple. Rewind. And watch the men on the screen. Elkins goes to vote for Merritt, but Hancock is faster. Elkins heads back to his desk, but before he can vote, Joe Crabb turns around and beats him to it. There is so much going on during the vote on the HPV vaccine mandate, you really have to pay attention. Start with State Rep Hamilton at his desk, who leans over to vote a second time for his deskmate Dan Branch, then reaches back to vote for Charlie Howard and casts a fourth vote for Wayne Smith. He's not the only one scrambling to vote. Rewind the video and take a look at the top of the screen. State Reps West and Phillips both lean over to vote for themselves and their deskmates. Phillips votes a third time for Christian. On the left, Donna Howard votes for State Rep Vo. State Representative Dunham didn't have to leave his chair to cast 4 votes. One for himself, then for Coleman, Martinez Fisher, and then Vesey. Sometimes the voting is across party lines. Hartnett, a Republican, reaches back to vote for Democrat Oliveira. Democrat Matt Reynolds votes for Republican England, and Republican John Davis votes for Democrat Noriega. Most voters have no way of knowing if their lawmakers are actually casting their own vote. Even though the legislature is broadcast on cable TV, the cameras change from this to this when it's time to vote. But if you're sitting on the third floor gallery,
I certainly noticed that there appear to be far more votes on the tick board than there were people in the room.
Arnie and Laurel Weiss were baffled when they came to see the legislature in action.
It seems very inappropriate and they should do something about it. Yeah, definitely.
State Rep Debbie Reynolds says voting for other members is done out of necessity.
We have a lot of votes. We have a lot of amendments. And there's times when we don't break for lunch and we don't break for dinner. We don't have bathroom breaks.
Necessity or not, one thing is clear. They aren't supposed to be doing it. According to the official House rules, written, voted, and approved by lawmakers at the beginning of the session, any member found guilty by the House of knowingly voting for another member on the voting machine shall be subject to discipline deemed appropriate by the House.
Clerk, bring the bill to record.
So, should lawmakers do it?
Well, there's no question.
At face value, it seems a blatant affront to their own rules.
It is against their own rules, but the issue is with enforcement. Now, it's the Speaker's job to make sure the rules are followed. He declined to talk to us on camera, but his spokesperson sent us a statement that basically says they leave it up to the House members. Although the practice is widespread, we couldn't find any instances of lawmakers being disciplined for voting more than once. Nancy Wilson, CBS 42 investigates.
If you'd like to read the full statement from Speaker Cranach's spokesperson, you'll find it on our website, KITV.com.